All right. Well, I think we'll get started, and hopefully our panelists will be able to join. I've resent the link, so but I don't want to delay much longer. So let me just. I want to start by thanking everyone for joining us today. Those of you who are joining on Zoom and those of you who are watching from YouTube. I'm really excited about this workshop. Today, we're going to be hearing from an amazing group of people, including activists, organizers, researchers, and healthcare providers. And we'll be discussing the history of Pride in Hamilton and surrounding areas, current challenges, especially in the wake of COVID-19, and current health issues that are impacting LGBTQ plus individuals. We've planned this workshop during June because this is Pride Month. It's a time for celebration of LGBTQ plus individuals, as well as a time for reflection about our history and an opportunity for change. We were reminded earlier this week about the need to educate and promote change for the LGBTQ plus community, which is as important as ever when we learned that David Gomez was brutally attacked at Toronto Island for being gay. In addition to Pride Month, this month we also commemorate National Indigenous History Month, which is a time when we honor the history, heritage, and diversity of Indigenous peoples in Canada and recognize the strength of Indigenous communities today. This year, this falls during a time when Canadians are collectively mourning the loss of 215 Indigenous children whose unmarked graves were recently discovered at a former residential school in Kamloops, British Columbia. And so we acknowledge that the land upon which the AIDS network is located is the shared traditional territory of the Haudenosaunee and Anishinaabe peoples, protected by the Dish with One Spoon Wampum Belt. This historic peace agreement between the Iroquois Confederacy, the Ojibwe, and the Allied Nations represents a commitment to share and protect the land, water, plants, and animals with respect. We wish to honor the original peoples of this land and express gratitude for the opportunity and privilege to work with communities across this territory. So I'd like to start today's workshop by introducing the speakers that we have here today in front of you. So Tara Buchanan is a cisgender lesbian settler who uses she, her pronouns. She supervises a supported employment program within developmental services at Community Living Brant through Sorry. Just remembered to put the recording on. So there we go. Apologies. Through an intersectional feminist anti-oppressive framework, Tara also works within the LGBTQ2S+ movement, including program development and inclusion training facilitation. She also chaired the Brantford Pride Committee for 5 years. Mike Kirk was born in the mid-1940s and grew up in a time before being gay was legal. There was no social media and no cell phones or computers to connect people. Mike attended university in the 1960s at the height of the Vietnam War and the counter-social movements. He experienced firsthand the birth of gay-friendly groups on campuses and the slow growth of a larger and more visible gay presence in communities. Mike has spent a lifetime changing attitudes from the inside of organizations, one person at a time. Since retirement in 2004, his focus on changing minds and attitudes has shifted to working as a patient educator inside university and college programs in the healthcare field, changing perceptions of aging gay people. Ken Giesen started his social action work at the AIDS Committee in London in the mid-1990s. He's a social worker who advocates for families and children. He's volunteered with the AIDS Network in Hamilton and was a member of the Hamilton Pride Committee. In 2014, he joined the Brantford Pride Committee and became an adult advisor for the newly formed Youth Pride Committee. Ken is currently the co-chair of the Brantford Pride Committee. Graham Crawford grew up in Hamilton. In 1980, he came out and moved to Toronto. His gay political awakening occurred in 1981 after the infamous February 5, 1981 bath raids. He served as chairperson of the Right to Privacy Committee, then one of Canada's largest gay organizations fighting for gay rights, including raising money to help cover legal costs of those charged in the bath raids. During that time, he spoke before the Toronto Police Board as well as before a House of Commons Standing Committee about gay rights issues. His first Pride Day event was the Pride Day celebration and march in Toronto in June of 1981. He's lived in Hamilton since retiring in 2005. Christine Wildman is a queer settler who uses she, her pronouns. She is committed to social justice and is a Brantford-based 2S LGBTQ+ activist and community engaged researcher. Dick Passmore is a lifelong resident of Dunville and was one of the founding members of Pride Haldimand, Norfolk, where he is still an active member. As an ally, he was MC of the first Pride Day event. Professionally, he has worked in the Indigenous community as well as training the homelessness serving sector across Canada and the US. Cameron Kretsch is a queer Hamiltonian and a vocal community advocate. He was on the Pride Hamilton Board of Directors from 2018 to 2021 and is currently the chair of the City of Hamilton's LGBTQ Advisory Committee and a proud member of the Governing Council at the Hamilton Center for Civic Inclusion. And Matthew Lewis has been a registered nurse for 21 years. Most of his work has been in emergency medicine, and he currently works part-time in the emergency department at St. Joseph's Healthcare in Hamilton. Since 2014, Matt has worked part-time with the City of Hamilton Public Health Department on the harm reduction team. His focus on the team has been sexual health, specifically dealing with the sexual health needs of the MSM, men who have sex with men, population. Matt is very interested in MSM sexual and mental health and strives to provide equitable health care to all. And I'm Jillian Watkins. My pronouns are she, her. I identify as a lesbian, and I'm the former interim executive director at HIV/AIDS Resources and Community Health in Guelph. I'm thrilled to be working with the AIDS Network on this workshop series.
Can't hear you from there.
When you're done your meetings, can you please help me with my social studies?
I will try. It's going to be a
So this workshop is divided into two parts with a half-hour break in between. At the end of each part, there will be time for questions. If you have a question, you can click on the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen and type it in. Alternatively, if you'd prefer to ask your question out loud, you can use the raise hand button, and then we can unmute you so you can ask the question to the panelists at the end of the section. Please type in any questions at any time during the presentation and we'll answer them at the end. If you'd like to send a message to myself or to any of the panelists, you can do so by clicking on chat and selecting who you want to send the message to. I'll ask the panelists who are speaking in the first half of our workshop to leave their cameras on and the other panelists to turn them off. And with that, we can get started. Okay. So I'm going to pose, we have 3 questions prepared. I'm going to pose the first one and ask each of you to respond in whatever order makes the most sense. So the first question is, please share your thoughts on the importance of Pride for members of the LGBTQ+ community and your memories of early local Pride activities.
I feel like Graham should kick us off.
I'll just get you to unmute your microphone there, Graham.
No, I'm happy to do that. And I must say, by the way, just one, I'm thrilled to have been invited to this and to share memories. I will also, though, confess to having to spend some time reflecting on those memories, as it's 40 years ago. And, you know, I was 26 and a half at the time. And it was actually, I had to try to make sure I was remembering correctly. And it wasn't that I was misremembering facts, but in some ways I started to realize I was conflating, or at least there was the potential for conflating facts. So I started to do some digging. I reread a thesis by a wonderful guy named Tom Hooper, who wrote his thesis on the Right to Privacy Committee, of which I became chair back in the 80s. So he did a great history of that. It was very helpful. What I do want to say, just by way of context, is I came out in literally January of 1980. In February, the bath raids happened. I was not a user of the bath houses because I barely knew what they were, to be honest, at the time. But I was so outraged when I saw what had happened that I and other gay friends decided we had to go to the initial demonstration that happened the next night. And that was my political awakening. We took over Yonge Street, and the cops tried to, they didn't know what to do because there were too many of us. And it was very organic. But then, more demonstrations happened, and then Pride Day, first Pride Day for me. Pride Day in June of 1981 is sometimes referred to as the first official Pride Day in Toronto. It's not true. It's the first Pride Day that became an annual event in the form that it is in, with people gathering and an official march or parade. But there was lots of stuff happening 10 years prior to that. Some of it at Hanlon's Point, some of it at Allen Gardens, much smaller, but nevertheless, gay organizing was happening long before this, quote, first Pride Day. I do remember the first Pride Day, though, because I not only attended, I was one of there were plenty of people who were organizing, but I was a member of the Right to Privacy Committee at the time, which was formed to, fight back against the oppression caused by the bath raids. And there were found-ins, 286 found-ins, and we were there to help them change the law, but also to raise money to help them hire lawyers, because so many of them didn't have any money to hire lawyers. So therefore they'd have to plead guilty. And we didn't want that to happen. But Pride Day itself, I did reflect, and I thought, well, how did I feel at the time? And it was a mixed feeling. It was mostly, I felt emboldened. I did feel proud that we were organizing, that we were doing it in public, that it wasn't a demonstration. We weren't taking over Yonge Street the way we had to with the demonstrations. But it was also just a little bit risky, because we didn't know whether people would come, because this was during the daytime. It was at Grange Park, near the Art Gallery of Ontario, that park that is south of the Art Gallery, directly south. And we were also going to be doing a march, which was my first ever march as a gay person, an out gay male, even though I had participated in demonstrations. Those weren't marches. Anyway, I remember feeling very excited about it. I felt that it was amazing that we could stand side by side in public, in the public square, as it were, being gay, carrying banners, and protecting each other. Because I can assure you, if it was two of us or me and 10 of my friends, we wouldn't have done it. It would have been too dangerous at that time. And as I think many people know, sexual orientation was still not in the Human Rights Code of Ontario. We were fighting, it was an uphill battle. We were fighting for all kinds of stuff at the time. But as you said off the top, Jillian, bashing of people is still happening. That has not changed. It happened then, and it continues to happen. Anyway, those are some memories.
Sorry, I feel like you should go next, because I feel like I kind of came late to the party and always kind of joined established Pride committees. And you kind of, I think, were near the beginning of the Brantford Pride Committee, if that's okay.
Sure. So you were pretty close to the beginning, I think, too. But thanks so much for sharing, Graham. I think it's so interesting to hear firsthand accounts of such early on Pride movements and things that were happening. So thank you for sharing. I remember I actually wasn't, so in Brantford, actually the Bridge, which is a social justice committee, started first with some organizations and a few LGBT members at the time, thought that there should be some action happening. So they actually organized a flag raising in Brantford, but it wasn't easy. There was a woman whose name is Jane Carter. Maybe if we have time later, I do have some pictures, but I won't show them right off the hop. But she became involved with what was known at the Bridge at that time. And she advocated, she'd march into City Hall and talk to, at the time it was Dave Levesque, who was the MPP of Brantford, and she would go right into his office and say, we need to raise a pride flag. For many years, actually, before it happened or before the Bridge was even organized, Jane was organizing community events like dances and gathering spaces in Brantford for many, many years. I remember before I knew that there was even a community here, the first thing I went to was a dance that Jane had organized that she just put on. I'm not connected to anything. So she got connected with the Bridge and they raised a pride flag. That was 11 years ago. And I can only speak for myself, but I imagine why it's so important to the community is that I had moved away when I was young. I didn't see myself represented. I came out when I was, 13, 14 years old to my friends, and there were no groups that I was aware of. There was nothing happening in Brantford that was represented myself. So I moved to Toronto as soon as I could. And then when I moved back many years later, and I found community there and all of those things. But when I moved back to Brantford, I saw that in the paper that there was this pride flag was being raised, and I went. And it just made me cry. Like, I was so happy seeing the pride flag go up, and just to see, I didn't think it would impact me that much, but I can imagine that other people felt the same way in their communities. Or I remember the very first Pride I went to in Toronto, I was 18, I think, just seeing queer people, like just seeing older folks that were couples. Like, I was 18, the only thing I saw that was gay was on TV, or trans folks. The only thing I saw was in the media, which we know does not portray us in a realistic light. So going to Pride and seeing that people are living like healthy lives, people have children, people are, there's people of all different races. There's people of, it was just so eye-opening, and it made me feel like I wasn't alone. And it made me feel like there were people that were like me, and that there was this whole world out there that I could be part of. Whereas when I was just sitting in Brantford in high school, feeling very isolated, that was really scary. And so that's what Pride really meant for me. And then when I saw it in Brantford, it just meant so much to see it be represented where I came from. And being a white cisgender woman, I can only imagine what representation would feel like for other marginalized groups too, Two-Spirit folks, Indigenous folks, people of color, which we know haven't really been represented as much. And hopefully, I know that when we were starting to try to organize in Brantford, we were trying to keep that in mind, like people that were more marginalized, how could we keep them involved? So I know it was always important to us to try to have events that were, free, so that everyone could join as well. And I think that's really the most important part of the Pride movement to me, and hopefully to others in the community. And I think we hear that time and time again from people as things grow and morph. It's just having the visibility and knowing you're not alone, and that there's other people out there that you can connect with, really.
Yeah. So again, I had kind of similar feelings to Tara and Graham. Again, going to Toronto Pride for the first time, again, just that feeling of overwhelmed, I think, joy and pride. And again, I remember tearing up too, and watching parades and watching people. Again, I think it was PFLAG usually got me. PFLAG or some of the churches, right? That there are people out there that supported kind of the community. And again, so with me organizing, again, I was on the Hamilton Pride Committee for a while. I'm currently with the Brantford Pride Committee. And again, I always felt like, again, they were established. So there weren't a lot of fights or challenges, I think. I think one thing, Tara, again, with the Brantford Pride Committee, again, we started with the march, and we started on the sidewalk, and because again, I think we felt like we couldn't take the street or something, like we weren't, I don't know if we weren't important enough or like we had to start somewhere. And I remember we were picking up garbage too, almost like we're trying to legitimize why we're doing this. Like, and I got why, but I remember doing it, but thinking I shouldn't be doing this. I should be just, you know, walking, being proud. There doesn't have to be another reason why I can do this. Which again, we eventually got to that we took the street, we took one lane, and then I think at one point we decided, you know what, we're just going to take two. We're just going to, you know, we're going to take up space. We're going to do this. So I think some of my other memories of Brantford Pride. So again, we usually did like, it was in Mohawk Park, very kind of grassroots, but we just had lots of rainbows, and I think at one year we got like a big rainbow balloon arch. And again, I started with the Brantford Pride with the Youth Pride Committee. Again, there were a couple of youth that felt like they weren't represented and they needed to have something for youth. So, and again, I'm a social worker and work with families and children. So this kind of seemed like a good fit. So, and again, I remember some of them came in and were just, again, so overwhelmed and so happy with the rainbows. And they couldn't believe, I think that this existed in Brantford, that, you know, that there was this community. Because again, some like 12, 13, 14-year-olds who were just, again, so excited to see the rainbows. So, and then again, we did a Jane's Walk, and Tara had organized that, Tara and a few other people, and had asked me to do kind of a queer space in Brantford. So I did some research, kind of went to the library, kind of scrolled through the Brantford Expositor to try and find information. Again, there wasn't a whole lot, but kind of from what I could kind of gather, at the beginning, again, there were small groups of people that would meet in Brantford, but it wasn't publicly known, right? And unless you got an invitation to something like that, you wouldn't know there was a community. And again, and there were a few little kind of coffee shops that started, but then it wasn't until really 2002, there was a gay bar that opened, and it didn't last long in Brantford. And a couple of us were talking, and we can remember that, you know, people would stand outside with potato guns and shoot people as they came out. And the owner was quoted in the paper saying that he constantly, or let me get his quote right. He says he got at least a half dozen incidents a day of people screaming faggots, faggot at him. So that bar did eventually close. And then in 2004, there was another group that started that would start trying to do dances. So they would take over local restaurants. But again, it was still very kind of not as open, because it would talk about how they would wait for the bar or the restaurant to close, and they would paper up the windows so that people couldn't see who was in there to kind of protect the privacy. So again, that was still 2004 in Brantford. And then, like Tara mentioned, kind of the bridge started, and that's when I think things started to get a little more, to progress a little bit more in Brantford. But yeah, those are my kind of, I think, memories and thoughts of kind of earlier prides.
Do you mind if I show a few of the pictures just really quickly? I feel like this is a good spot, if everybody's okay with that.
Let me, you should be able to share, I think.
Okay, so this is a picture of Jane, who was one of the founding and was really the founding member of Pride. So she actually moved away a few years after Brantford Pride started to Guelph. But this is her with Dave Levesque, Dave Levesque actually purchased the first Pride flag and got it raised in, it wasn't just him, it was mostly Jane's work, but she did influence him, which was great. And then I just have like 3 pictures of the first Pride, because I know that I am, and I feel like Ken is as well, really proud of the the Pride in the Park events that happened, because I think some of the issues with, and I know that's the next question, but I think sometimes the community has expectations of what a Pride should look like, and they're all different because we're such a diverse community. So this is just a few pictures of Brantford Pride in the Park, which was always such a nice event. So this is the rainbow arch that Ken was talking about, and it is like entering the park. So you're kind of going into this like wonderland. And we always had like different booths and activities all along this path in Mohawk Park. And there's just big, beautiful trees. It's a really family friendly, but also just like fun out there event. So this is kind of like another view. This is over different years, so it's not the same year, but just some different things that happened, a lot of activities for youth. And then the one picture I wanted to show is this is actually one of our bigger marches. And you can see so many youth that are just like out there having a great time. You just were reminding me of all the images I saw yesterday when I was going through the pictures, Ken. And I actually have one of the very first Pride. I should have shared that one where the youth committee walked. And that's what was also really cool about Brantford Pride. People would come to us and we were only a few volunteers, like maybe 5 usually at any given time, 5 to 7. And we wouldn't have the capacity to do events for everyone, even though we wanted to and we knew it was important. So I remember when the youth came and we said, hey, we would love for you to, like, what do you want to do? Join us, right? Like if there's 1 or 2 of you that want to let us know what you can do. And then also when we had folks from the trans community come to us and say, we really want to be involved as well. And we were like, hey, yes, join the committee if you can. And if you can't, what events can we help you put on, or, you know, and just try to give the support to the community, just because there is so many folks out there that want to participate and everyone has different ideas of what a perfect Pride is. So those are all the pictures. So I'll stop sharing.
Thank you so much, Tara. Those are great pictures. So we had Mike join us. We had a few technical difficulties, but so glad that you were able to get on, Mike. And we were actually just finishing up discussing the first question about your thoughts on the importance of Pride for members of the LGBTQ+ community and memories of early local Pride activities. So maybe you could share a few thoughts on that.
Sure. It's one of those points in a long arc of history that's super important, because Pride in the form it's taken over the last 20 years is the transition between being completely part of society and being completely not part of society. It's an absolute necessity that we go through this period so that we become, in a way, completely mainstream. So yeah, a Pride Day will be a wonderful day that everybody celebrates, because we have different people in our community, the same as there are other celebrations that are held during the year simply celebrating because people are different in our community. And we're moving much quicker to a point of complete inclusion than we are to where we were when I was the age of many of the people in this room. While the comparison isn't completely transferable, think of it about the way that the Irish population was thought of in the United States in the 19th century. There were bums on the street, and then there were Irish underneath that. They were a oppressed and completely ostracized group in society. What do we celebrate today? We celebrate St. Patrick's Day because the Irish are all included in the whole community. And we take a day to recognize that, hey, yeah, part of who we are is Irish. And I'm hoping that that's the day we move to with things like Pride, where it's a day to say, oh yeah, for today we're going to look back and remember that we're all one big family, but some of us have a different basis or a different way of looking at sexuality. That's my 2 cents.
Okay, so let's move on. Thank you. Let's move on to the second question. What challenges and barriers did you experience organizing or participating in early Pride activities? Who wants to start? Graham?
I'm happy to kick this one off too. The difficulties, oddly enough, the first Pride day and march that I participated in, that I've already talked about, which was June 1981 in Toronto, there didn't seem to be any difficulties in organizing it and actually doing the march. It was more how we felt about the difficulties, and that was one of constant danger, really. So amidst all the joy and celebration, and also, I mean, lest we forget, Pride Day was established as a political gesture. Yes, we were celebrating our orientation, but it was a political statement. And sadly, I think we've lost some of that. Certainly Toronto has. The corporatization of Pride, in my opinion, was a big mistake. We fought against it when I stayed, because I was involved with the Gay Community Council in Toronto, which followed, 1982, 1983. Lots of arguments on the council, differences of opinion, mostly centered around the police. We were supposed to, despite what they were doing to us at the time, and it wasn't just the bath raids, we were supposed to hold out our hand and collaborate and cooperate. It was a PR stunt and we wanted no part of it, at least some of us didn't. The police wanted to march in Pride. We didn't want them. They were our oppressor. Why would we want them to be marching with us in a parade that was about our statement, a political statement? I still feel that way, to be honest. I know some things have changed. There are out gay officers now, but in a sense, I say, so what? There's out gays in every sector of the economy, like literally everywhere. Now they have a tougher time of beating us up or firing us. But that's kind of what I view as the biggest change. We're protected by law now. So difficulties, I think we ended up starting to have difficulties within our own community about making decisions about who should march with us, who should attend. Should we take corporate sponsorships? Should we let a corporation connect with us so they could attract gay clientele, which is why they did it. I mean, why else would they do it? Maybe they were an enlightened corporation. It basically came down to marketing. And so those kinds of issues, if you believe that Pride was fundamentally a political event, at least founded on politics, it's pretty tough to sort of say, oh, well, all is forgiven. Let's give the cops a float. Let Toronto Dominion Bank have a float. Let Imperial Oil have a float. Whomever, pick a company. A lot of us didn't want anything to do with that. Some of us still don't. I don't want Toronto Dominion. I stopped going to Pride in Toronto for this very reason. It also got so big, it was a circus, but it's filled with corporate floats now, and I don't like that. It's a statement. I mean, you don't have to agree with me. I'm okay if you don't. It doesn't upset me. But these are discussions that were happening in the early 80s that were quite contentious within our own community, within the organizing groups that put Pride on.
Graham, I'd absolutely 100% agree with you. It has moved way to the point of political action. And it's almost as if the parades have become a pawn in a much larger power struggle than what they originally intended to. I saw the best benefits and the most confidence and community building in those small little prides, like the one in Brantford or London or any other small town, where people are demonstrating on their own. They're sending their own message, not one that has been hijacked by some large corporation or some political agenda.
I think that we saw the same struggles, even though it was years later, right from the beginning. Because the first year of Pride, I was kind of a side member. I was on the committee, but I had to work actually that day. So I didn't participate in the actual march or I think there was a small dance the first year as well, that were on the same day, a walk and a small dance. And Ken can correct me if I'm wrong, but the very first Pride in Brantford. But right from that get-go, we had a lot of debate from different members, one around, corporate. I mean, here it's on a much smaller level. Folks are wanting to maybe have a booth at a park or donate some money to help the event happen. But we also had debates around alcohol was a big one. Do we want to have events where alcohol is served? What sort of events do we want to have? In the beginning, I think alcohol was the biggest sort of discussion point in Brantford, because people weren't really vying to sponsor until we grew a little bit. And then we did have, of course, the same folks on a smaller level that wanted to also get involved. So I think that, again, like I said before, we're such a diverse group, right? We have gender diverse, we have sexual orientation, we have all the plethora of folks that are part of our community, and everyone has a different idea of what Pride should be. And it's really hard because you do want to make everyone happy, and you try not to let your own biases of what you would like to see happen as well, because we all have our own ideas too. So I think those were the biggest challenges in the beginning. And the problem is, if things don't necessarily go, it can fracture communities that are already small. So it's really hard to negotiate within the community and try to have everybody feel heard and to build, because that's really always what I see happening, right? Is to build it so that we get stronger as a community, regardless of the things that are happening around us. So I think that was one of the hardest things, I think, and that's not just early organizing. I think that continues today, right? Like so trying to work together and make sure that everyone's voice is heard is always a challenge, I think.
And I think reflecting back on my times on Pride committees, I look back to when I was on the Hamilton Pride Committee. It was about 2010, and we gave into rainbow capitalism. We were sponsored by a beer company. We had this was the Pride that we were at Bayside Park, and I forget what the beer company was, but they gave out free beer in the beer garden, and it was just I think I'm still recovering from that event. But I look back and I think, we were catering to white, able-bodied, cisgendered gay men, right? We wanted to create a party for them, but we weren't including anybody else, really. Again, we had like brunches at Whitehorn where you had to pay for. Like there weren't a lot of free events. So, and again, I'm kind of embarrassed, ashamed to say I was part of that, I think. Again, I think we got caught up in it, but again, I was so glad, I think, when I came to Brantford and again, got that grassroots. And then again, when Black Lives Matter, that really woke us up, I think, to say, what, we need to get back to our political roots, right? Yes, it's a celebration, but we need to get back to that. And I think there's a group that I forget who it is, but they keep talking about kind of bricks and glitter. Like you need both, right? You need that political roots, but you also need to celebrate what you've got. So I think it's not really a challenge, but yeah, I think just, again, some of my reflections.
Sorry, Mike, did you have something to add there?
Yes, I was just going to take you back to my ill-gotten youth, and we would not be having any of this discussion. None of it. Wouldn't happen. because being gay was still illegal. So to me, the first really gay pride event was the Stonewall Riot. It was a time when we said, okay, we're kind of done with this. And I think it was a bit of a wake-up call for the other side as well. And I know that the police bring a lot of baggage with them, but we have to remember that they are not necessarily all of the problem. They do not make all their own decisions. They are the tools of society, the tools of the political system. They do what the law tells them to do. And at the point where we finally changed here in Canada in 1969 with the first Mr. Trudeau's omnibus bill on justice, and the government got out of the bedrooms of the nation, we started to change to a way of thinking differently and acting differently. It's just that the institutions have taken an awful long time to catch up because they're rooted in a system that is now some 70 or 80 years out of date. And that will change slowly. Again, that goes back to the point that Graham raised about corporatizing of pride and things around it. That just simply returns the whole struggle to a control by the larger interests, which are not our basic interest as gay and transgendered people.
I just want to add something really quick that Mike made me think about, and Ken also made me think about. We talk about the corporatization, but there's also the struggle of the fact that we want to provide events for people that are fun. We want to provide a day where people can come together and celebrate, and we can't do it because we don't have any money unless these corporate entities give it to us. And it's and that was, I think, one of the biggest struggles later, like as we progressed in Brantford Pride, is how do we not engage with those, but also provide a day that is fun and celebration. So, and I think we all deserve a day or two. And in Brantford, there's not a ton of events that happen throughout the year. So it really is like that 1 week, or this year, actually, Brantford Pride, great job. It's a whole month, which is cool in Brantford for the first time. But how do we do that? So I think that's also a huge struggle that has probably been since the beginning of time, is how do we provide this space and this time without any funding or funds or money, especially for when a huge majority of our community don't have the funds. They're struggling still, even today. I mean, trans rights just came in 2017. And so, I mean, people are still really marginalized and don't have the funds. So it's a really tricky question. That popped into my head.
Yeah, it's difficult. And Graham, I'll let you go ahead.
Thanks. I agree. It's a real challenge. I think that what it does do, though, is it puts a test to our innovation. And I don't have the answer here. I don't pretend to have the answer. We went through it in Toronto. But if once you agree to take a lot of money from a lot of different corporations, then it transforms. You're looking for bigger and bolder and more exciting. And I will confess, like others have, I thought about gay men at Pride in 1981, 82, 83. I mean, I was fortunate enough because I was in the quote movement that I knew some just terrific, lesbians who were part of the organizing committee. But beyond that, people of color, those of different abilities, trans people, honestly, I think I can almost safely say we never gave it a second thought. Not everybody, but it never came up. I can say that for sure. It was never discussed. And, Ken said as he looked back, he was slightly embarrassed about that. And I'm embarrassed that we didn't even think about it. that it just wasn't on our minds at the time. We were struggling. Gays and lesbians were working together. That was kind of it. But I back to the point about the corporatization. I think what's happened in Toronto, because I remember one of the events that I was part of early on, we got the Parachute Club to come and play. They had a hit record at the time. They did it for nothing. We had sound technicians who did it for nothing. We didn't need sponsors. We pulled it off, and it was an incredible Pride Day celebration at church in Wellesley. We took over the 519 Cawthra Park. We went to our own community to host it. And I don't think there were a lot of corporations. In fact, I know there weren't a lot of corporations there. And it was calling in favors, asking people to do stuff for nothing. But the wonderful thing about our community, and in the broadest definition of that now, that was not what it was back in my day, we're everywhere and we have all the skill sets. I mean, I realize some of this stuff costs money, and the trick is, well, how do you raise money if you don't do it through corporate sponsorships? And again, I don't pretend to have the answer, but I know it's possible. I know it's possible. Beer companies they were all over us at the time. They're still all over us. Because I mean, of course they are. And in a way, you can see how tempting that is, because it's like, well, people would talk about, oh, they're accepting us. And, it's like, really? How important is it to you that Molson's accepts you? I, for one, don't care what Molson's thinks of me. I know what I think of me, and I know what I think of us. And if Molson's wants to supply beer without their logo and, umbrellas and tents and so on, then they can supply beer. But if they're doing it purely for marketing purposes, which of course is why they do it, it's a very tempting proposition. I just think we need to figure out how to fight it. Still, today, 40 years later.
Okay, I'm gonna just ask the third question, and then if we can get back to this as well, but I don't want us to miss it. How do you think these challenges impacted the physical and mental health of LGBTQ plus individuals?
I'll start just because I see a lull. So I think one of the things that I thought of is that division that happens in the community because of the challenges. And there's lots of different challenges. We spoke about a few, but there are many that we didn't hit on, I'm sure. And then it can cause a community that already feels isolated. It can cause it to fracture even more. And then people really feel alone and isolated. And so I think that's part of the challenge. We know that when people are isolated, that their health is impacted greatly. We know that when people feel alone or hopeless, that their health is negatively impacted. And I think that happens for a lot of folks. And I think if you don't see yourself represented in your community or your communities, depending, then that's really going to impact you. So I think that it's the division, but also the fact that people aren't seeing themselves represented in the prides, whatever that might look like. I know we talked about Toronto. When I went at first, there was like this sense of elation, but then when I was in Toronto, not during Pride Week, I never really actually felt like I fit in there, because it was really catering to a certain population, a lot of men, but also not just men, a lot of money. Like when you would go out, there was a lot of money there. And being a student, and I know if I had have stayed longer, and when I connected into different parts, that's the other thing. We look at, there's one idea of what the community is, but there are so many little pockets of community happening. Like in Toronto, there's the little political pockets, and then there's the drag pockets, and then there's the pockets, and you have to take the time to really wade through it. And I think that can really help. But when you're first getting on the scene, you might not know about all that. It takes time to learn about all that. So I think the isolation and just the division of things can be challenging for folks.
Yeah, I'd completely agree. And I'd add one more dimension to that sense of isolation. And that is the fact that by and large, the gay community is fraught with ageism. People of my age don't exist because nobody wants to be my age. Nobody wants to have to deal with the issues of growing old as a gay person. So we get a double whammy in that, yeah, we're considered part of the community, but now we are isolated in that community simply because nobody wants to be like us or ever be like us.
Possibly as the second oldest person on this panel. I remember housing for gay seniors being discussed back in the early 80s. And so I'm in my 20s at the time, and I'm thinking, sure, well, we'll go ahead. I mean, talk about it if you want, but I didn't really pay any attention. I mean, it's just the trappings of youth, unfortunately, I think. Because of course, at the time, because you had to be so careful about losing your job and so on, and a lot of gay people, and I speak certainly to, about gay men at the time, which I was more familiar with, had low-paying jobs. So this notion of pensions and, equity in housing in your house and all that stuff was just nonsense. So what happens when you hit my age or your age? Where do you live? How do you pay for it? And so this notion of there were people at the time, so 40 years ago, looking into how do we deal with this? How do we do community housing? And how do we make that happen? Not much came of it, by the way, that I'm aware of. I mean, if it's happened in other cities, great, but I'm just not aware of anything like that happening. These are bigger issues. They're tougher to solve, but they need to be talked about, I think. And sadly, that discussion is going to be almost as preliminary in 2021 as it was in 1981. We haven't made any progress in that regard.
And add on top of that the issue of nursing homes or retirement homes for gay couples. They don't exist. And quite a few relatives wouldn't want Sam and Fred living in the next unit to Great Aunt Alice, because those people are a little peculiar. They want us. And then add on the top of that, the fact that some of us are HIV positive. Nursing homes don't want a thing to do with us.
How's that for a couple of old downers?
We can, does anyone have anything else to add on that before we move on to some Q&A? Okay, thank you. So I'm just going to look through, if anyone who's watching wants to ask a question, you can type it into the Q&A. We did have one question in the chat that I'll start with. Sorry, you can also raise your hand, and you can ask a question out loud if you raise your hand. So that's another option too. But the first question we received was, that's a striking point about corporatization. What about visible support by community organizations like public libraries, health units, universities, etc.? Is institutional allyship helpful or problematic in regards to making political statements? Okay, go ahead.
Yeah, well, given that I raised it first, but others have commented on it, of course, because we've all experienced it. My immediate reaction is, if we have social institutions like libraries and other community organizations that want to participate. If they're able to sponsor a little bit, that would be, I think, great. As many of you know, in Hamilton, just as recently as 2 years ago, with the Hamilton Police Service, they wanted a recruitment booth, which they were willing to pay for, and staff, of course, at Pride, and Pride Committee said no. And I was not a part of that committee. I'm not part of the organizing group at all, but I support that kind of thinking. So there's a social institution. You say, well, that's because a library is a social institution, so police are as well. Except libraries aren't beating us up. Libraries aren't throwing us in the back of cars like they used to in Toronto and taking us to Cherry Beach. Libraries aren't standing back and watching us be attacked by vigilantes. So I think Pride made the right decision there. Yes, I think if there are organizations that are prepared to be part of our celebration, that we should consider that. I don't think it's an easy thing. I think you have to establish some pretty clear criteria, because any sort of municipally funded organization, well, there's lots of them there's certainly a few of them that I wouldn't want to see at my Pride event, police being one of them.
Thanks, Graham. Does anyone else have?
Go
ahead, Tara.
I was just going to say, I think it's also really important. I feel like Ken maybe was going to unmute, but I was waiting. Ken, no? Okay. I think it's also really important that those organizations aren't just, so with the bridge, we also do safer spaces training. And I think it's really important that those organizations aren't just showing up at Pride, but that they're actually doing the work to be more supportive of the community, because we know that there are still huge barriers. There's been research done locally here that shows that the trans and queer community are still feeling very excluded from social services. So I think it's important that those organizations show their support, but not just on Pride Day, that they also are doing the work. And there are many in Brantford that are doing both. They're doing the training, they're making it part of their yearly trainings and updates, and they're committing to the work. And I think that's really important too.
Okay, there was another comment. It wasn't quite a question, but I just thought I'd share it, that we used to raise the money from within the gay community, and we had no problem raising the funds. I think that's when we were talking about, like, to the same point about corporatization. Go ahead, Mike.
Yeah, I was just going to say, yes, we did, but you can only expect to go back to the same well so often, and that is one of our problems. We drained that well, and we drained it for a number of different reasons. Most of them all good, but we didn't rebuild it and replenish it so that it could bubble up again. We didn't expand it.
I did want to kind of add to, I think, again, I'm not sure if this is the case, but I'm wondering whether the people within the community might be the able-bodied white gay men who might not be happy with where Pride is going. Like this political, that it might not be an option. And again, I'm not sure if I'm speaking out of turn. I don't know if I've got too much to base that on, but
no, I don't think you are speaking out of turn. I think you're absolutely right. And we got to remember that each of us here advocates in different ways. Not all of us would step up and go to a whole week's worth of gay pride events in Toronto, where many of us would work quietly in a community on the same issues.
Graham, go ahead.
Yeah, I don't pretend to know about fundraising these days in our community, because I really I just don't have any experience. I do have a ton of experience, though, back again in the 80s in Toronto. So, for example, the Right to Privacy Committee, so this isn't about Gay Pride Day, but it's certainly about Gay Pride. 286 found-ins, most of whom couldn't afford a lawyer. What do we do? So we raised money for legal support. We worked tirelessly to put about 23 lawyers together who either did it for nothing, pro bono, or they tremendously reduced rates. They worked together. We then started passing the hat in the community. Because remember, back then, people were loath to write you a check to the Right to Privacy Committee with their name on it. So it was cash. So, and it was also a lot of private stuff. So some of it had to be done in, like at dinner parties. I mean, I had a horrible notion of, a bunch of, comfortable white gay men sitting around a dinner table and saying, yes, I'll give some cash. Here, I brought along a few $100s. But we also went to bars with buckets and people threw cash in buckets. The Right to Privacy Committee over its life raised almost $250,000 that way. There was no other way to do it. Now, that was about an injustice. That wasn't about an annual event. And again, I don't pretend to know what the right answer is, but I do think there is some, way of maybe tapping into those of us who are a little older, who couldn't, whether it's a legacy donation, I don't know. But I mean, how do community foundations work? They don't spend all the money they're given. They bank most of the money they're given, and they pay out the money they earn in interest. That's a multi-year program. It might even be multi-generational. But if we have to give in to corporatization, that's the easy route. It's right in front of us. There's a corporation saying, I'll give you 25 grand if you'll let me have a float with my logo, or if we can hand out trinkets or whatever. In fact, to be honest with you, I have no idea what they're paying in Toronto these days for that sort of stuff. I don't know what a corporate sponsor, and I know they have, they've done the sort of standard multi-tier, there's like the diamond sponsor and the gold sponsor and all that sort of stuff. But we've just turned into everybody else. And that's the thing that I resist the most. I still do. And I know I'm harping on this, but it continues to bug me, to be honest.
We have another question, this one from Caitlin. Is there a generational difference with perhaps millennials and Gen Z folks less inclined or unable to make donations to events and organizations?
I think oh, sorry, go ahead, Mike.
I was just going to say an absolutely resounding yes. The younger people will jump on a GoFundMe page in an instant, yet they won't think of a long-term charity and give anything to.
I know in Brantford, we also did the tiered system for a few years, just trying to drum up the funds. But we first, of course, tried many other options. But we're a small committee with limited, ideas. And I think that there's always great creative ideas out there. And I think that I think it's going to be a balance moving forward, because I think all of the things that we've all talked about are challenges to it. And I think being creative and because you do have to get the money from somewhere, and sometimes the community in where you are might not have it. Sometimes they do. And maybe it's just not hitting the right people, but I think it'll continue to be, kind of a challenge, but I know that there have been lots of creative ways. So I think it'll be an ongoing thing, but I absolutely love this discussion. I think it's great. It makes me feel better knowing that these aren't new challenges, but they're challenges that everybody has been facing since the beginning of the movement and probably will continue to face moving forward. So, and there have been lots of great suggestions too. I've been looking in the chat. So I really appreciate how all the different things that have been brought up and different ideas.
So I think we might have time for one last question before we go to our break. I was wondering if maybe each of the panelists could share a piece of advice for folks that are doing organizing today. Some of you are still doing organizing, but something that, you know, from this discussion or just from your experiences, you feel like would be helpful for folks who are organizing and participating in Pride events right now.
I have to say, Jillian, you promised no pop questions, but
oh, you're right, I did. Only if you feel comfortable responding.
no, it's okay.
No pressure.
Yeah, I think my piece of advice, again, just listen to different members of the community, right? And try to listen to the people that aren't speaking, because they might not feel respected or feel like part of it. So again, try to just listen.
Yes, people need to keep doing what they're doing, and don't be afraid to change over time, because what we can do today, we may find we are physically or emotionally incapable of doing later on, but we can do other and different things. So advocate. Sometimes advocate's throwing bricks. Sometimes it's building bridges. Sometimes it's working behind the scenes to win people over one at a time. But we will be willing to continue to reinvent yourself as what activism or participation means to you, and keep at it, even if you can only do a little bit.
So I'm going to be a little, maybe at the risk of being cute, or maybe not, I don't know. But think of two words. My advice would be two words: party, period, politics, period. Pride for me is both, and must always be both. It must never be just a party, because then we forget why we actually started doing it. We also, I think what it suggests is we think everything's fine, and it's not. The politics part, if you just do politics, it's a bit dull. And so why would you, what's to celebrate? So you just do politics. But I think if you can do both at the same time, by design, not by accident, I think then we honor the past, how this started, that struggle that continues. It just continues slightly differently. And it certainly continues as deeply for members of our community as it did for those of us who were organizing 40 years ago. People in the trans community are suffering, in ways that we're not right now. At least I'm not right now. But I certainly was having my own struggles 40 years ago. And so were my friends, just walking down the street, not in a flamboyant manner, and getting sucker punched because we were gay in Toronto, and beaten up. It's still, as you again, Jillian, as you kicked off the session, it's still happening. I thought, based on what we know so far, the person who was beat up from the Toronto Island wasn't doing anything except being gay. That's 40 years later. So it ain't over. It's a long way from being over. So reinforce party, period, politics, period. Do both. Try and figure out how you do both. Never lose either message. Have fun being really aggressive and opinionated.
I don't know, there was so much great advice, but I think that for me, it's just find your passion and go with it. And if you follow all these great words as well, and do what you can do, and just follow. I love the listening and staying connected, and just knowing that it'll never be perfect. We all grow, we all make mistakes, and we all learn from them. And as time goes on, we'll we've all looked back on our time, even though it was more recent, and kind of shook our heads. But just be open to change and listening and moving forward. And yeah, follow your passion because it's never easy. So as long as you are passionate about it, hopefully it'll keep it going.
Thank you. Thank you, all of you. There was one last question, just someone asking about if panelists would be willing to make their contact info available in case people would like to follow up with them. So I'll touch base with the panelists after this is over, and if those who are willing, we can take a look at how that can be shared. So thank you so much to our first group of panelists. This has been such an exciting and interesting and I think educational discussion. We'll be coming back in half an hour for the second part of our workshop, just to give people a chance to stretch their legs and whatnot. In part two, we'll shift gears a little and we'll be discussing current Pride organizing and participation, as well as the impact of COVID-19 on our LGBTQ plus community and current health promotion challenges. So I hope everyone will stick around or come back in half an hour. This will remain open, so you can just kind of turn your camera off and mute yourself and then join us back here again at 10:45. So thank you so much, everyone. Hi, everyone. Welcome back for part 2 of our workshop. Great to see you. So for this second part of our workshop, we're welcoming back Ken to speak with us again. And we also have our remaining panelists, Christine, Dick, and Cameron. We're going to continue our discussion about pride and health. We had a fantastic discussion this morning focusing on the history of challenges with pride organization, pride participation, and the impact on LGBTQ plus individuals. So for the second part, we're going to be looking at what's going on today. What are our current challenges? How has the pandemic influenced pride? And how is this influencing the health of LGBTQ folks? We also have Matt. Hopefully Matt will be able to join as well. It looks like they're here, but maybe not on camera yet. But I think we'll get, oh, perfect. Hi, Matt. Perfect. So let's get started. The first question I wanted to pose to everyone is, how has Pride changed over time? And what are current challenges with Pride organizing and participation that you have experienced or are aware of? Big question. Is there someone who wants to sort of start us off?
Yeah, I'll jump in, sure. Yeah, I think that there are challenges that were talked about in the first part of this panel are pretty similar to some of the challenges we're facing now in Pride organizing. I'm not currently a member of Pride Hamilton's board, but I was involved from 2018 until earlier this year, and so I was involved in some of the organizing recently there. And we're still facing a lot of the same problems of inclusion that I know the panelists in the first half talked about. Back then, I know Graham and Kirk talked about how, primarily you're looking at it's just white folks, a lot of white gay men who were, coming forward to talk about their issues, marching in parades. And now we need to be thinking more broadly, right? And I think that a lot of organizations are thinking about that inclusion, which is great. And they're trying to push that. But until everyone is included, until everyone is part of this, until everyone feels accepted, there can't be a lack of protest, a lack of support, a lack of outreach, a lack of love can't be the approach we have, right? It can't be that it's safe for this group now, so things are okay. I got mine, so I'm not worried about you. And as long as there continue to be groups who are part of the rainbow, members of Two-Spirit and LGBTQI plus communities who are suffering, who don't have equity, who aren't part of equal systems, everyone, right, has to continue to fight for them. And I think that's probably what we're facing right now is there is sometimes a divide. Some people who think that, hey, things are fine. I'm not being impacted by this any longer. I fought my struggles already. There is no end to the struggle. We're not going to solve this tomorrow. This is going to be a long relay race that gets built up with many communities, not just communities to us LGBTQ plus folks, but communities in lots of marginalized and oppressed communities. This is not a silo. We're all in this together. And so I think it's important to start it off by saying that, right? That there have been lots of gains made, progress has been made, but we have a ton of work to do, and we can't rest on the successes we've had.
Thanks, Cameron. Is there someone who wants to, who also wants to respond to that? Yeah, Dick.
Hi there. So, yes, when we looked at the individuals in the first half, spoke a lot about the early days of Pride. But as one of the organizers of a fairly new Pride, a fairly young Pride event, I just want to give you a little bit of a historical context to start off with, and then I can talk a little bit about some of the challenges we've faced in current organizing, if that works. Okay, so Dunnville. I grew up here, small, rural, predominantly white, predominantly Christian, conservative, patriarchal community. Not a very diverse place growing up. And surprisingly, we have a strong, socially engaged community when it comes to challenges that face our town. So back when they tried to close our hospital, everyone rallied around. We had farmers come in and barricade the hospital with tractors. Like, how rural can you get? When they tried to put toxic waste wells, the community rallied around an environmental cause, which kind of sounds the opposite of what you would expect from that small, rural, white, Christian, conservative community. But the community bands together when there's a need. So we realized back in 2016 that we need to do something more for our community to be more inclusive. So the late Ken Hancock, who has been involved in social justice issues when he was a young person right up through until he passed, decided that we should really try to be more inclusive in our community for our Two-Spirit and LGBTQ plus community members who were very largely marginalized in this small town. So he started working on trying to build our Pride event. And knowing that knowing the community well, we knew that a march was not necessarily the best approach for us to start off with. So we wanted to have more of a celebration of our community members. So with a very small group back in 2016, we started planning this locally relevant model. And then finally, May of 2017, we held our very first Pride event. There were just a few of us doing a lot of the work. And we decided that we would just have a celebration in the park, an open and inclusive celebration for our community. We expected a small turnout, being a small town, and we were shocked when we had over 200 people. The newspaper said between 200 and 300 actually showed up. I was MC, and it was just a sea of beautiful people in rainbows and smiles and dancing and singing. And we had live music, and our community partners were there, and our vendors were there. It was very much a homegrown event. We also had our agitators who arrived. They decided to target us. They came in with their homophobic speech, their xenophobic speech, their hate speech, they were antagonistic. But our community banded together and basically tried to shut them out. Police arrived and did basically what police do, which is the good people on both sides kind of a thing, but sided more with the agitators, which ended up causing a lot of problems for us, for our community. Long story short, we moved forward in 2018. We were bigger, we were better, more prepared. We had an amazing group of people set up there to help us. And the agitators arrived again, and then they moved on to the Hamilton Pride event later that month, or the next month in June. 2019, we grew again. We moved to a bigger venue. We had more security features in place. We had the most inclusive Pride event that we've had out of the three was our 2019 event. It was so amazing to see the diversity of our Two-Spirit and LGBTQ plus community showing up from all over the place, not just locally, but from Hamilton, from London, from Toronto. We had people coming in from everywhere. One of the big things that we got from this is that there were some challenges that came out of it, I should say. We had people who were personally targeted by the agitators that arrived. There was our founder who had a confrontation in his residence and an assault. We've personally had vandalism at our place. Our Pride flag was stolen. I think we had 3 or 4 of them stolen altogether. Graffiti, confrontation on our property with people. We've had people in our downtown core spreading hate. But our Pride event has become an activity of inclusion, and our community has rallied around us in general. We've had more people in Pride in the last year or so than I've ever seen. We've had individuals coming forward saying that they finally felt safe in our parks and felt good to be a couple, a gay couple in our park for the first time in their lives. We're seeing a lot of youth. We're seeing a lot of our senior generation coming into our events. We have some other positive effects is that we had the first barrier-free access to a stage in Haldimand County for performers at a Pride event, which has now set the standard for how things operate going forward with events. And finally, 3 days ago, the first Pride flag flew in Haldimand County at the county office after a lot of agitation by our community members and a barrage of calls and emails. And so the challenges we've had, we have met by asking lots of questions of our community, acts of allyship that have really emboldened and strengthened our LGBTQ and Two-Spirit community to be able to take more of a role in the front line of things. I've been able to sit back and not MC anymore because we've managed to open up the space and make it safe for our community members to actually be on the stage. So it's an ongoing process, and COVID's made it very difficult because our meetings are all Zoom, and those Zoom meetings become more of a social integration piece than they are a planning piece. And it's really hard to stay on track with that stuff because we're so separated from everyone. But the big thing for us is really just listening to the community, taking direction from the community, and moving forward with new ideas and getting youth involved more. And we've really had a great success with our social media platform now that we've got younger people. I have to say younger people now because I'm one of the 3 elder statesmen in the group here today. So yeah, so that's where we are. So I'll just pass it back to you, Jillian. Thank you.
Thanks, Dick. Ken, can I call on you to go next?
Yeah. I feel like I talked a little bit about this in the first part, but again, I think it's changing. Yeah, that prides are becoming more inclusive and more kind of wanting to include more folks. And again, I feel like that was with the Black Lives Matter, that was a bit of a turning point where everybody kind of stood up and went, yeah, wait a minute, we are not doing a good job. We need to do a much better job to include people. And again, and I said it before, kind of, I'm ashamed that I didn't see it back then and wasn't kind of part of that, but and that it took that protest in Toronto or that kind of that action in Toronto to make us stand up and change. But yeah, I think that's again where things have been changing. And again, there's been resistance in the Brantford community anyways. So yeah, and again, it has kind of divided us a bit. And again, I think with COVID now that it's kind of gone away a little bit, because, or not away, but because we haven't been able to march or meet or kind of put out these statements that police aren't kind of invited to participate in uniform. So, but again, I imagine it will, once we go back in person, the division might get a little bit, or it might start up again. But yeah, again, that's I think where it's changing and kind of the challenges that we've been having.
Thanks, Ken. It looks like we hopefully temporarily lost Cameron, so hopefully they'll be able to join us shortly. Christine or Matt, anything to add before we move on to the next question?
Sure, I can add something. I actually don't organize Pride events currently, but I was on the Brantford Pride committee at the time that we had decided to ask the police not to participate in uniform. So I think that's been a very, very big challenge because there's been lots of disagreement in the community about whether or not that should be happening. And as one of the people who was sort of one of the faces of Pride at the time, I faced lots of harassment from like individual police officers at that time, like sort of like intimidation factors, but they were actually never really invested in Pride locally anyway before that. And I think one of the challenging things at a community level is trying to get folks to a point where they understand the need for Pride to be more inclusive. Because, you know, I remember getting messages from people when Black Lives Matter sort of did their pretty awesome sit-in at Toronto Pride. I started getting messages from people saying, I agree with Black Lives Matter, but there's no place in Pride for them. And I was like, what? Are you saying there's no place for people of color in Pride? Because you're missing a pretty big piece of what is of what the real situation is, right? Like Pride has been it's so exclusionary for so long that people actually believe that people can't be, Black and queer or Black and trans at the same time. And I think as somebody who does a lot of education now, that's what needs to be happening at a community level. Like we need to be providing more education about inclusivity and the importance of inclusion, and the fact that, Pride can never be a celebration, like completely a celebration, until everyone is included. And I think in that area, there's just so much more work to be done.
Thanks, Christine. Cameron, hope you're still there. I don't see the video anymore, but did you want to share a couple additional thoughts before we move on to the next question?
Yeah, sorry, my internet's mad. There's construction in my neighborhood and they're just like tearing up everything. So I think I apologize.
Not at all.
This is one of the challenges of these virtual events, right? Is your internet is real and people can impact it. But it should be working okay for now. I found a backup. But yeah, I want to talk a bit about safety and just respond a bit to some stuff Christine was saying, that there is a real tension, I think, in these situations around inclusion and safety, right? What does it mean for this to be a safe space, Pride to be a safe space? What does that look like for people? And not only we have to think about physical violence, I know that Dick was talking about that a bit in terms of the folks who have showed up in various places around the GTA. Hamilton Pride, of course, was a touchstone moment for that in 2019, where people came and violently attacked folks. And I'm sure everyone here and many people watching know about that, so I won't go into it. But there's a tension between this notion that Graham brought up earlier, which is around police being the oppressors in 1981 and being there to harm folks directly, and them not wanting them to be part of pride parades. And this idea about marching and rallies and how that works, this idea that traditionally marginalized folks want to be part of pride celebrations, but that at the same time, so do police. And so I say, and I've said this many times, there's a preoccupation in my belief, by police wanting to be inside of pride spaces, inside of spaces. And then there's a tension when you start getting into corporatization, right? So you have a mainstreaming effect that occurs when you corporatize. I hope I'm making sense here, but what's happening is there's a mainstreaming effect. There's this idea that these spaces that are there, they're supposed to be safe spaces for everyone into as LGBTQ plus communities, right? Those safe spaces are supposed to be there and supposed to be for members of our community to feel safe in. They don't necessarily feel safe if police are there in uniform, if police are marching in parades. What do rallies look like if they're meant to be inclusive? So those I think are important points to think through. Sorry, my internet is mad.
No, I think we heard you pretty clearly, despite a couple fluctuations there with the internet. Thank you. Does anyone else want to add anything to that question before we move to the second question in response to Cameron or any of the other speakers? Okay, great. So next I wanted to ask about what are some examples of the impact of COVID-19 on the LGBTQ plus population and how can service providers help address these impacts? It's been a pretty unique year or so, and that's impacted our community in so many different ways. So interested to hear about your thoughts on that. Christine, thank you.
I see Matthew unmuted, so Matthew, you go ahead.
No, I was gonna say I missed out on the last one, but that's okay. I didn't have much to offer for the last question, but maybe For this past 15 months has been very challenging, and I'll speak for Hamilton Public Health. We, sadly, we've essentially shut down so much of our healthcare services that we were offering, and I mean, we've diverted so much of our staff to the COVID-19 response, understandably, but certainly at the expense of other healthcare, and I can't help but think there's been a huge, well, I know there's been a huge impact. Some of my work specifically is I do a lot of, point of care HIV testing. That's sort of been my focus. And pre-COVID, I was doing a regular amount of weekly testing, we'll say, and it's essentially has disappeared. Now, very slowly but surely my numbers are creeping up again, but I have to wonder, where did people go for the last 15 months if they were looking for any sort of testing or certain healthcare? A lot of, and I don't know if I'm taking responsibility for everything Hamilton Public Health has done or not done in this situation, but yeah, we did shut down almost all of our clinics, and we have really limited services. And I'm not happy with that. I have to be careful what I say here, but it's unfortunate. And so we're people in, certainly a lot of people who even have family doctors, it's been challenging to see them. It's really been challenging to access proper healthcare these last 15 months. I hope, well, I know we're close. We're getting out of this kind of state of lockdown, and things are slowly starting to open up. Public health is very slowly but surely going to ramp up our services again. But I appreciate it's been incredibly challenging for people to access, sexual health care. And yeah, it's really too bad.
Thanks, Matt. Christine, did you want to go next?
Sure. If it's okay, I'm going to share my screen because I actually did research within Brantford and Brant County over the last year with 2S LGBTQ+ community members. And I want to share my screen because they're the ones who did the research. It's just sort of flowing through me. And I think some really interesting things have come out of COVID-19 for people. And so in the research, folks talked about COVID-19 related fears, for example, like fear of the unknown or uncertainty for the future, fear of dying or friends dying, particularly friends who might live alone, who may have illnesses that would make them more vulnerable to COVID. People talked about feeling isolated and missing friends, or like the loss of physical touch, for example, and being stuck living with unsupportive people. Folks talked about, and so this photo that was done by Maggie is actually about, it represents youth in Maggie's mind. They said that, it represents the youth that may be living on the brink of their homes and struggling to hold on. And Maggie shared that, many university students, for example, are stuck living at home right now and doing online schooling. But what happens for them is that they've lost their communities because their queer and trans community would have typically been in their school community. And for many students, they're living far away from home in regular times, and now are sort of stuck back at home, it poses many challenges that I think that particularly locally, like counselors, for example, haven't even, they don't know how to typically support 2S LGBTQ+ youth, never mind during pandemic times where everything is sort of amplified. Folks also talked about the loss of Pride events and how hard that was. And Willow and Courtney shared this. They had planned to go to sort of many Pride events over the month of June. And Willow shared that she's newly out as a trans woman and was really excited to attend Pride, and then all of the events were canceled. And Willow's actually a frontline worker in healthcare, so it was pretty hard on her. And when we sort of dug a little bit deeper into what it means for Pride to be canceled for people, they talked about it being the one time of year where they could connect with other community members, people who were like them, because we don't actually have queer specific space. And it's not necessarily safe to like go out with a small group of people. And other people talked about Pride being the one time of year where they can actually be themselves out in public, and how much that means to them. So I can't imagine how folks are feeling having sort of going into the second year of not being able to gather in person. I have a couple of other ones. So folks also talked about the ways that they are connecting, because connection is so important. So some people talked about, like Shar talked about connecting online, and a couple of other people talked about connecting in safe social gatherings. So around a fire, 6 feet apart, and when permitted, obviously. So I think it's really interesting to think about the ways that those connections can still happen for people. And I really love these photos. Willow and Courtney shared these two photos. The first one is, when you can't go to the beach, you can bring the beach to you. And they created this really cool beach vibe on their balcony where they could, tan and just chill out. And then they also created a movie night under the stars on their balcony. And they talked about like not being able to go out and have date nights, and how important like intimacy and spending time together is, even during pandemic times. And that, typically as trans women, they would have a hard time going to the movies without being met with discrimination and possible harm. And the pandemic actually helped them to think of new ways to do things like enjoy a movie together that didn't feel like it was, every other night sitting in the living room. So I think that's really cool. And people talked a lot about like masks. So masks have a big impact on people that we don't necessarily think about, but it actually changes the whole interaction process. And people talked about like making masks and giving them away rather than supporting those capitalizing on them. Masks invisibilizing some people, or being political. So having the ability to walk down the street and like display your pride through wearing a mask, or allyship even. But I did want to share, Willow shared one story about a mask where she said that, masks are so important because we need to keep everyone safe. But for Willow, as a trans woman, wearing a mask has a way of stripping her identity and undoing the strides that she'd made to wear her face proudly and confidently. She said that queer and especially queer and especially trans people have a hard time valuing their appearance. And her smile took her a long time to wear proudly and confidently, and now it's obscured every time she faces the world. And she said that appearance is more than how people see us, it's how we see ourselves. And time spent hiding that appearance that we struggle to find pride with is as familiar as the closet we once found ourselves trapped in, which gives me the chills every time I read it. And Willow really was talking about, if your smile, for her smile was her most kind attribute. And having to hide it all of the time makes it difficult for her as a trans woman to sort of face the world and be seen for who she is. But I did want to share a story. I'm taking a lot of time, but I wanted to share a little bit of the positive things that came out of what people were experiencing related to COVID, because I think that's also very important. So people talked about the different and unique ways that they're using to connect with family, chosen family, friends. And so people talked about so supporting each other. So for example, this first photo was submitted by Michael, and this is his partner, Stephen, who at the beginning of COVID started on his YouTube channel, started a Songs for Isolation, and he performs live, and he's actually got followers all over the world. And it's something he did to keep himself busy while being isolated, but also he really felt the need to like provide entertainment to people, which is a really great way to find community and connection during pandemic times. And Michael also shared that he did a Facebook fundraiser where his partner shaved his head online to raise money for 2 charities that had to cancel their annual fundraisers. And these charities were very important to him. And they actually raised over $3,000 by just shaving his head online. And for Michael, he said that giving back to community and spending time working towards providing for community makes you feel like you're a part of a community. And then Rebecca shared that, while Pride was canceled, it's still really important to recognize that there is community support out there. So she went around and took photos of community support that she could find. And I think that generally the sense that I got from folks from this research was that they had a deep sense of supporting one another and keeping themselves and others safe, and getting through the pandemic together. And I'll just end with Willow's words because they stick with me and probably will for the rest of my life. We must be strong, continue to use safer means of reaching out, and show the strength of our community to reflect a family. We are resilient in learning and overcoming.
I really appreciate everything. Sorry.
No, go ahead, Cameron. I just want to say thank you. That was great.
Yeah, I really appreciate everything you contributed there, Christine, and especially talking about the kinds of spaces that people are finding in the pandemic. I mean, I know I was on the board last year at Pride, and we were thinking about digital Pride, and we were one of the sort of first organizations in Hamilton to have to confront that issue. What do we do in this space? How do we make this space? And the big question was, how do we make this space safe? And I'll be honest, we were quite lucky that we didn't have a lot of folks trying to bomb our meetings or anything, Zoom bomb the meetings, I should say, and that kind of thing. We have moderators standing by, and it was very supportive. What it makes me think about is accessibility, right? So many folks, I know that you talked about this in terms of barrier-free access. I think it was Dick, maybe Ken, who talked about barrier-free access to events. And a big challenge for a lot of the events in Hamilton has been making them as accessible as possible. And a lot of folks reached out to say that they found that a digital event allowed them to attend in a way that they weren't able to participate and feel included before. And so I think that we have to think about what that means going forward. And Pride events in the future are always going to have to think about how there can be a digital component involved, how we can make these spaces accessible for people, so everybody can feel included. Because I think that there's been a lot of activists in Hamilton who've been part of Pride organizing who are also disability rights activists, and they've always foregrounded this, right? This idea that we need to have spaces for folks with disabilities, and they need to be visible and seen when they want to be. What I also think is important to mention here, and I think it goes back to what I was saying before, was something I wanted to finish saying. This allows for creativity in our spaces, right? So what's happening in these spaces is a kind of creative void is being filled. Everything is new for everybody in digital spaces. So those spaces are new and they're uncharted territory. And when 2S LGBTQ+ communities get into those spaces, they can create in new and innovative and queer and trans ways that are beautiful and wonderful. And we had that opportunity in 2020, I think, to do something like that, to lead, to learn new skills, to show what those skills can look like, to do it in fabulous ways. And so I think that that's a really bright spot there. I think, though, that what happens, though, of course, is that there is that tension of the mainstreaming effect that happens over time, right? So now that there's a norm around digital spaces, there are kind of social rules and cultural rules around how we interact in these spaces and what we do, that we have to be conscious of protecting that space to make sure, again, it's safe for everybody, it's inclusive as possible, and then it's an active site that we have to be able to both celebrate and protest, right? And when corporations come in to sponsor stuff, we got to be thinking about what that looks like, how that looks like, how that transforms those spaces and what it does. And I mean, for a big thing last year, it wasn't a big thing, maybe it was small, but I mean, when police were thinking about how they would celebrate Pride, they got in their uniforms and they put these frames around themselves in Hamilton, right? Hamilton police put these rainbow frames around themselves with their uniforms on, right? That was jarring for many people in the community to see that kind of action. It made a lot of us think about who gets to own online spaces, who gets to participate in Pride spaces online, the co-opting of hashtags, right? Another thing that's been really discussed in Hamilton a lot is, and maybe not super widely, but our politicians don't really participate in Pride here in a way that makes sense. Like even John Tory would be absolutely attacked by everybody in Toronto if he didn't show up to the Pride Parade. Though in Hamilton, no one can say definitively they've ever seen our current mayor at Pride. So there's a showing up to Pride, of being present inside of communities and spaces where maybe for some people rocks their comfort zone. That's a kind of accountability, right? What happens when you're a spectator at a webinar for Pride as a politician and you don't have to have that accountability anymore, right? What does it mean to be part of saying, please attend this digital Pride thing, please do this thing, please participate in it passively? Where does that accountability go? So I think that those are all really important things to unpack as we think about the legibility of Pride in these spaces and what it means to democratize it.
Thanks, Cameron. Ken or Dick or Matt, Matt, actually, you've already spoken to this. Ken or Dick, do you have anything you wanted to add?
Yeah, I just wanted to kind of chat about digital prides. And again, I think it's great that, again, we can offer those spaces, but we also need to be cognizant that not everybody has internet. And so we've been running in, we've got an open mic coming up. And we've had someone in the community who has always performed at our open mic nights, but does not have a strong internet connection, so can't. So we're trying to come up with creative ways, like maybe they can record it beforehand and we can present it then. But again, trying to be aware that, again, not everybody has access to internets and coming up with creative solutions. What I wanted to kind of say too, so I've been working with youth, and again, I think online is great for them, but I think they also enjoy the in-person stuff. We used to do, again, pre-COVID, we would do a youth pride dance, and we'd probably get close to 100 youth coming out. Again, 13, 12 and up. And again, and that was, for some of them, that was the first time that they could kind of come out. We usually have like little name tags where they could put their chosen name, their chosen pronouns. And a lot of them would say, like, this is the first time I can kind of do this and I can be my authentic self in this space. So again, I think it's important that we do go back to in-person eventually. But yeah, I think that's all I wanted to add.
I've just been coming up with little ideas about this whole digital divide piece. And, we know from a health equity standard that there is such a huge gap. And knowing that, from our experiences through our workplace in COVID, understanding now that we need to pivot a little bit and be able to bring those live events that we're doing to those who are physically unable or even are challenged just in being those spaces. We should be able to be more inclusive yet with our activities. So this group, I've just actually texted out a couple ideas to our Pride committee based upon things that we're doing here. I guess this work really doesn't stop at any point in time, does it?
Thanks, Ken and Dick. Christine, did you want to add something? Yeah.
I did want to, yes. So I've done sort of over the years, I've done a few different research projects locally around service provider and access to services for 2S LGBTQ plus populations. And in terms of like the second part of the question we're talking about right now and what service providers could do, I think in locally, I can't speak for the other communities, but locally, generally 2S LGBTQ plus folks don't have equitable access to care, whether it's medical treatment, whether it's counseling, whatever it might be. I think that, there's big systemic issues to be addressed. But I do think the services that are being provided, folks need to be more aware of how these populations are differently impacted by the isolation experience during a pandemic. And, lots of the folks that I talk to don't have internet access. So their isolation is even greater than, people who do. And also, I think what's typically missing is an understanding that not all 2S LGBTQ plus folks experience a pandemic in the same way. And that, as a white lesbian, I might be experiencing isolation, but there's a significant chance that someone who's trans or someone who's a person of color or experiences a disability is far more isolated. So just being able to understand from an intersectional lens, the nuances of the way that people might be experiencing extreme levels of isolation at this time, and figuring out how to support folks through that. And sometimes, not everyone has access to being able to do a phone session with a counselor or a Zoom session with a counselor, and knowing that those services are needed still, and that organizations need to figure out unique ways to support people in this time.
Did anyone else have anything further to add on that before we move on? I actually think it was a pretty perfect segue into the next question. Just, as we think about the different ways that COVID has impacted members of our community, and as we think about that impact on, people's health, right? Mental health, physical health. And so as the last question for today, I wanted to talk a bit about some of the local health promotion challenges that are facing LGBTQ plus population, and how service providers can ensure that those challenges are met. So I think Christine started us off already with that, which is great. Anyone want to start us off?
Maybe I'll say something here. I think our challenge will be to get people to come back, and it's funny because there's been a couple issues where I've had clients who I've been caring for, and part of their reluctance was that our government's messaging for the last 15 months has been stay home, stay away from people, physically distance, and then here we are having a conversation about STIs. And eventually there's, trying to get through the discomfort of saying, well, clearly not everybody's physically distancing from each other, and that's okay. Like, that's life, and we know that. But the fear is that a lot of people have been reluctant to seek out healthcare for that reason, for almost, in addition to the regular stigmas that exist, it's now I guess I wasn't following the rules of physical distancing. And so, I've delayed seeking healthcare for that reason. But I hope now that, again, that we're sort of nearing the end of the pandemic, or hopefully that's not going to be an issue. And again, I certainly strive to not, to make it as open and as easy for people to access healthcare. But I appreciate, what Christine and what some of the people have said, that, yeah, there are barriers, and there have been huge barriers the last 15 months, and there are still, and hopefully this will all end soon. So.
I think that one of the really interesting things that service providers need to keep in mind is that the impacts of COVID are going to be long lasting. People's physical health, people's mental health are going to be affected for more than, you know, a month or two after COVID has gone away and life sort of gets back to being able to see each other in person. I think that the funding will stop, like the COVID related funding that's coming to all the organizations will stop happening, and people will go back to normal service provider responses to things. But the impact of COVID is going to have, you know, long lasting effects that we need to be keeping in mind. And so my hope is that organizations will continue to apply for funding to address some of the issues that we're going to see happening through, you know, for the next, you know, 2 to 5 years or more, because of all of like not accessing healthcare, not accessing mental health services through this time.
Yeah, I think that that's super apt. We're also thinking too about mental health and about isolation. And I know that there's been research out of McMaster University's Labor Studies program in the last couple of years, a report done called Mapping the Void. That report really talks and unpacks, you know, from a pretty good sample size, the kind of safety and isolation folks from 2S LGBTQ plus communities are feeling, and how frankly those groups are more impacted by negative health outcomes than other groups. And this is before COVID, right? So this is before we're faced with a pandemic. We know from research that's being done, especially in Black communities, especially for other people of color, that they're more impacted by COVID, right? And when we think back to the history of Pride, I think it's a bit of what we've been touching on today. And we think about activists like Marsha P. Johnson and others who, you know, Black trans activists who started this movement. Like, we need to remember and think about that that's a part of the present activism we're doing today. Is ensuring that the health outcomes for those who are most vulnerable are prioritized. And I think that means that cities need to think through things like vaccine. I mean, right in the current moment, I would say, just to be very live to it, right? What does a 2S LGBTQ plus vaccination clinic look like, right? What does it mean for, and not to pick on the board of the health folks at the city, Matthew, but I think that these are challenges being faced across the province. But what does it mean for a medical officer of health in any of our regions or municipalities, right, to use the broad powers available to them under the Public Health Act and other kinds of legislation to say, look, to the province, look, like, you're not doing enough. We have local communities who are suffering. There are parts of the city where we need to make sure that those vaccine clinics are opening and happening and people are getting vaccinated. We're just going to do it. Take us to court, right? I mean, I'd love to see the province of Ontario try and sue the city of Hamilton for prioritizing the health of its residents, right? And the public, and take that precedent to court and fight for the rights of people who need them. Those are the kinds of things I think need to be happening, and the kinds of positionality that cities need to be taking, because as we continue to have these fights and continue to have struggles, we're going to see what happened in Hamilton. You know, when activists, Pride organizers spoke up when there was violence, we saw a lot of politicians double down with pretty problematic rhetoric, saying things like, well, you know, it's the fault of the folks who organized the event. It's the fault of all these other kinds of folks. And we see that stripping away of resources available for organizations supporting members of 2S LGBTQ plus communities. And we talked earlier about who's the responsibility for that. And it's great that you could get buckets of anonymous money at bars. You know, that was a thing that was happening. I think that anonymous money is kind of the best money in a way for these things. And it's great that that could happen. But when it can't happen, what is the responsibility of our local government? What is the responsibility of other governments to step in, drop some money on us into the situation and say, we're going to fund space, safety, we're going to do the basics, and we're going to make sure that folks have a place to be, a place to create, a place to start from, a place to recover from, a place to feel healthy from, right? What does that look like for cities and governments to do? We can't leave this to the private sector like we leave so many other things to expect that they're going to make the right choice. So many times we see, you know, TD is a huge sponsor of Pride events across the province, and I'll join Ken in saying that you know, there was certain naivete I experienced and certain ignorance I had when I was doing some of the organizing in Pride in Hamilton where, TD signed on to be a sponsor and I didn't think twice about it. I didn't get involved in the sponsorship committee. I didn't ask questions. But then when I reached out to Two-Spirit members of the community afterwards, they were saying, look, like, have you looked at the pipeline policies for those banks? And it was like, no, actually, hadn't done that. And since did and made sure in 2020, when I was still involved in organizing the event, that, hey, like, we weren't having that sponsor there. But then when you take that money away, what's the event look like, right? Is it enough to have an event that's not super flashy and super overproduced? My answer, I think, is yeah. But again, that's a tension that we have to think about and think through when we're making these choices about how it works. Anyways, back to health. I'll be quiet about these things. I think that health outcomes, especially now, are super important. And I think that there's a real opportunity for cities and city governments who have the biggest impact on the day-to-day life of residents in this country to step up and do something meaningful to improve health outcomes for 2S LGBTQ plus folks.
Yeah, just to build on that a bit, Cameron. I know that when we look at health equity again, and this, the global pandemic, the response that we've had has originally, it was, we're going to target geographical locations for distribution of the COVID-19 vaccines. We're going to target those high risk areas, and then we're going to blanket the communities. And then they decided maybe we should look at the data and realized, oh, suddenly we have certain parts of our community are at a greater risk. Why haven't we had that push to make sure that we take a look at the demographics in a more broader sense and look at those marginalized populations who have higher incidence or have higher risk factors? It bothers me to see this blanket approach where everyone between this age and this age, you're all the same. And we know that it's not an accurate way to do things. So again, not to harp on public health in Hamilton or any other community, but I think provincially we need to take a better approach to how we look at those equities and how we decide on which communities should get specialized services. And I'm 100% behind the concept.
Can I comment briefly? It's interesting what Cameron just said, that, and this is so true. There's such a, and I don't want to make this a political conversation, I'm sorry. There is such a huge focus in this country on our federal leaders and our provincial leaders, but what Cameron said about your civic or your city government has a huge impact on your day-to-day life, on everything you do in your city. And again, public health, yes, of course, it is a city-run organization. And interesting, at least in Hamilton, and I think for a lot of municipalities, the Board of Health, which makes huge healthcare decisions in the city, is largely made up of city councillors with no healthcare experience or backgrounds whatsoever, which, I mean, I only learned when I joined public health. I had really no idea that a Board of Health would be city council, essentially, which was kind of shocking to me. So city government, huge impact. And yeah, that was just a great point, Cameron. So thanks.
Okay, thanks everyone. Any further points anyone wanted to add? And if not, we can move on.
I want to just throw in, just to respond to what Matthew said there a little bit. Thank you. I think that you're right that the Board of Health thing is a good thing to think through. I think where I'd like to leave that, perhaps that thread, is where it resolved itself, I think, in my mind. So there were some successes in public health in Hamilton. So we've had some clinics in Hamilton that have focused on making sure that Black folks get vaccinated, people of color get vaccinated, and so those happen. But I think it's important to focus on how that happened, right? And that came from members of the Black community organizing with public health, showing up, helping to administer those clinics, signing people up in communities, right? Like it was a huge amount of work done by residents in the city of Hamilton to make that happen and make that a success, right? The same thing that's happening right now with the Board of Health in Hamilton. I want to highlight that. There has recently been a call and a push from health advocates around the city, from various aspects, saying, look, like the Board of Health is entirely made up of councillors. is there a way we can return to having a focus where we have public health professionals on the board, residents with experience, lived experience of health outcomes, these kinds of folks on the board as well, right? How do we balance it out so it's not just bureaucrats, or sorry, pardon me, politicians on the board who don't necessarily come with expertise, aren't physicians, aren't healthcare professionals, right? With an eye to this kind of stuff. How can that improve health outcomes for people? So I just want to say that I think that a great thing that's happening, I'm not sure in other places, but in Hamilton, is that residents here are so engaged, they're so active, and they're pushing all the time for this change. And it's beautiful to see because it does have real impacts, and people are getting services because of it. So just shout out to all the people who are out there pushing hard to make these things happen.
Thanks, Cameron. Any other further thoughts from any of the panelists before we move on to questions? Okay, great. So if the panelists from part one are still available, you're welcome to turn your cameras on if you like, if you feel like you'd like to respond to some questions as well, or ask some questions. Just taking a look, I don't think I see anything in the chat or the Q&A. So if anyone who's watching does have some questions, please, now's the time to put it in there. And maybe I'll kick us off, if Ken doesn't mind, if I throw out another question. This got me really thinking a lot about just that obviously we're talking about, and I think Cameron demonstrated a few times in his comments, this intersection between activism around health and activism around pride, and wondering what people's thoughts are on whether it's now during these digital pride events, or whether it's more looking forward to next year when we have Pride Month, what how we can ensure that like health promotion and messaging is taking, or whether, but how we could ensure that it's taking place at Pride. Like, what does that look like? What would that need to involve? Or maybe, I know a lot of it is happening already, but where can it be improved? If anyone has some thoughts on that.
Can I jump in? Oh, sorry, Cameron, you can go ahead. No? Okay. So I think, Jillian, like you said, like it's always been happening, but I do think it needs to happen at greater levels. But I also think there's a need for an understanding of Pride itself being about health. It really is. Like, for people who don't feel connected to community outside of Pride events, it's vital for them. And so, you know, I think there needs to be sort of a balance in Pride between being super political and let's challenge everything and you know, protest everything, but there also needs to be events where people who don't feel safe to attend a protest can attend an event where they can, you know, experience community and meet people and feel connected to people. So I think it's a challenging balance because Pride is political, right? Like, it is definitely political. Our existences are political. So yeah, I do think, I mean, I think there are ways that we can promote health in better ways and in bigger ways. So lots of times I think historically at Prides, there's been, you know, a booth about sexual health, a booth about mental health. But how do we incorporate these things in bigger ways so that, you know, approaching those booths isn't stigmatized? And how do we have conversations, especially coming out of COVID, about the long-term impact on all of us, instead of like having an individual lens that says, oh, this person is struggling and maybe it's because of this. We're all impacted greatly. And being able to talk about that, I think, is very, very important. And coming out of like anyone doing organizing, being able to talk about how hard it is for ourselves to be isolated, and how that affects our physical and mental health will help community members be able to also voice these things.
Yeah, I just want to say, yes, thank you for saying that, Christine. And you said a lot of what I was going to say, frankly. And one thing I think that's so important is I just want a big, beautiful Pride hug. And there's nothing like that, right? Is having that kind of experience of getting a big hug from friends or people you haven't seen in a long time at a Pride event. And that really does contribute to our mental health, right? That does contribute to our health overall. I will also say that, and I think that if others haven't done this before, maybe Hamilton would even be willing to lend you this thing, which would be cool. There's this big public health bus in Hamilton, and it comes to Pride every year. And I have to say, it's pretty wonderful to have that kind of message there. But it's also someone who sat on the board of directors for a few years of the AIDS Network. I'm currently still on the committee there. I think that we still have to be having those kinds of conversations about that health. I know someone in the chat is talking about HIV/AIDS and talking about folks in those priority populations getting vaccinations, which, I know folks in the community who have HIV/AIDS and who are living with HIV and AIDS and who are not able to access the vaccination system in any kind of reasonable way. And I think that had we had the ability to think through Pride in different ways, if there was the ability to do so, one kind of cool Pride thing we could have just done in maybe in 2020 and maybe even in this year, which I think, again, doesn't appear to be permitted through provincial regulations, would be just like set up the public health bus and vaccinate folks, right? Like that could have been a wonderful and beautiful thing to do for Pride, right? Meaning like we couldn't have had the whole event, but we could have had a piece of it there. So I think that this isn't the first time we're going to be facing these impacts of pandemics and health risks. If we listen to global scientists, and if what you said, Christine, is true, and I think it is, that we'll be facing these kinds of impacts in the future, I think there's a huge role for public health to play in these kinds of settings. And I think Pride spaces bring people together, and that's a place that we can mobilize health outcomes that are positive for people. So.
Thanks, Cameron. Did anyone else have anything more to add there? There are some comments, which Cameron mentioned. Let me just take a look. Yeah, one person said that for a long time, people with extremely low immune systems weren't being considered as priorities in vaccination. So for example, people living with HIV and AIDS, and they were left fighting to be vaccinated. So thanks for mentioning that. And I think, Matt, you replied saying that, yeah, the province would probably do things different next time around. I'm sure that's very true. I hope that's true. And that immunocompromised individuals should have been vaccinated earlier on. So thanks for those comments. So I just want to throw it out there if anyone else has any further comments or questions that they wanted to ask of the panelists, or if any panelists have any questions for each other.
I'll just add a little bit to the last question that you asked. So I work at Community Living Grant, and I think that one thing as well that can be brought up, we have a project right now called Belonging Grant. But what I like about that is that belonging really helps people's physical and mental well-being, right? When people belong to a community, people have their back. When they have a problem, they have people to go to that can support them. So if they have a health crisis, they're not thinking about it by themselves in their apartment. They're sharing it with their friends who are saying, oh no, that's a serious thing. Go to the doctor, right? And so we find that lots of people that experience varying disabilities are not having that community. And I think we know that people that are members of the Pride community are also not finding that community. So I think the direct correlation between the two is if you have a place to belong, if you have a community, then you have people that are looking out for you, and something that could be mild doesn't turn into something that is very serious and life-threatening. So I just wanted to point that out, because it's not even just about our mental health, it's about the community that surrounds us that helps us through those challenging times. And if we don't have that community, then we're at risk. So I just wanted to bring that up a little bit as well. Thanks.
Thank you, Tara. All right. Well, oh, sorry, go ahead, Mike.
Just one very short point. We all need to remember that we're all different and we all need different things. So the notion of having safe places and people we can talk to is hugely important. And we should also not forget or marginalize those of us who are aging. That, well, we may not look like the rest of our population and we may not act like the rest of the population. We need to be kept involved all the way along. We have good ideas. We have things to contribute. Don't just kick us to the curb because we're old.
Thanks, Mike. Oh, sorry, go ahead, Christine.
Mike, that's a really important point. I'm glad you brought it up. I think, so the Bridge has been for the last few years trying to work with long-term care facilities locally to provide training because, you know, we know that aging populations are struggling and we know what it, you know, the challenges of going into long-term care could be for people. And I do think that this is a population that gets missed in a lot of the service provisions that are happening. And I really do think there's a need to have like a greater understanding about the challenges that aging folks are facing with both their mental health and their physical health needs. I think there could be organizations in every city on their own that are supporting seniors who are 2S LGBTQ+.
Thank you. Dick, it looked like you wanted to share your thoughts as well.
Yeah, this is a different tangent from our main topic, so I don't want to pull anybody away from where we're currently going. I just wanted to speak very briefly on allyship. It's one of the things that it bothers me a lot is when someone comes out and says they're an ally. You're only an ally when the community recognizes you as an ally. You know, we need to be able to understand our privilege. We need to be able to use our privilege as a tool for positive action. We need to do actions of allyship and solidarity. We need to get involved and stand up and speak up. But just making sure that we ask lots of questions, take direction from the community, and become accepted as an ally, not put yourself out as one based upon your personal definition of what allyship is. I just wanted to get my little soapbox moment there on that piece. Thank you.
Thank you. Cameron, you mentioned in the comments you wanted to talk a little bit about taking up space politically. I think we have a little bit of time left for that, if you wanted to just share your thoughts on that.
Yeah, I think that one thing that we've probably not talked about too much is that a lot of the organizing historically, and even some of the organizing currently, although I think we're making greater space for more diversity in Pride movements, is pretty white. And I think that we have to acknowledge that that's a really big problem. I mean, I know that when I was on my way out of Pride, that was a big focus of making sure that we, as our inaugural term came to a close of our very, very young incorporated organization, that we brought in folks. And when I left, there was a very diverse board of I think more than 10 people there. And so, we made some progress there, but so much work to be done. What does it look like though to take up space as primarily a group of white folks politically, right? Like, what can we be doing to have rallies? How can we unsettle our comfortability around that, right? I think that we can learn a lot from Black Lives Matter movement, to see what happened over the last couple of summers, to see how you can have a safe rally. I mean, I was at a vigil at Bayfront Park in Hamilton last night, and it was very safe, and people were separated distances, and it was still able to do it respectfully and to be together in a moment of sadness. And so I think that we have to think about how that works too when we're thinking about rallies, and we have to ask ourselves, what it means to take up space and not ask for permission. Because I think that for many, when you're going through the system of asking for permission, which I think to be honest, is a pretty white-centered idea in lots of respects. It also involves asking all the authorities, the city's institutions, the police, closing off intersections. And again, like immediately that puts us in a certain kind of frame. And so I think it's important for, as activism continues, as we continue to try and make space for people to continue to have our voices heard, that we do make sure that rallies and marches, right, and protests, which started this, is that they're centered in part of the celebrations we have, because they're not negative things. This isn't some kind of strange black and white environment we're in, where this is a negative thing and this is a positive thing. I mean, sure, I think it's really important for us to think about the kinds of things that can lift everybody up in our communities, right? Across the board, every single person. But criticism, protest, marching, they're not negative, they're necessary. And so I think as we come out of the pandemic and get accustomed again to being around one another, we have to think about how we can be in those spaces together and to push ourselves outside of our comfort zones, so that we're being more inclusive. Because I think things like that can help to bring people in and make them feel more included, where they can see themselves. So just wanted to leave you with that thought, and maybe others have thoughts that are similar.
I just wanted to say, I think it's an interesting point that, you know, the people, when we are asking for permission to do these things, we're asking them from the very systems that are creating inequities in the first place and maintaining them, right? And I think one of the challenges I know from when I was on Pride was that, you know, if we were told, like, if you go ahead with this, you'll be arrested, like the organizers will be arrested. But we've since seen that that is not actually the case. And those sort of scare tactics that have happened, we need to be challenging those, totally challenging those, and moving forward with, you know, we don't have to ask for permission from the people who oppress us to do something. And I think we need to sort of get out of that mindset that, you know, cities and police have sort of drilled into us over the years.
Okay, anyone else want to share any final thoughts? I think that, oh, sorry, go ahead, Ken.
I was going to say, again, you're giving me all kinds of ideas for next Prides and moving forward, which, again, I'm grateful for this conversation.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that was actually a great way to end this conversation, just as we think about, you know, what do things look like, not just right now, but moving forward, as we are moving out of this pandemic, and we're looking forward to events where we can once again gather, build community, look at health promotion, look at healthy lives mentally and physically. So I just wanted to say thank you so much to this fantastic group of panelists. You shared your personal experiences, your wisdom over the years, your I guess guidance and education, and it's been a fantastic conversation, one that I know will continue in many spaces. And so thank you very much for that. I wanted to wish everyone, all of you and everyone watching, a happy Pride Month, and look forward to more of these conversations in the future. So yeah, thank you very much. All right. Okay. Thank you so much, everyone. I just ended the recording. So great to have had this conversation with you. I'll definitely be in touch by email to follow up.
Thanks, everyone.
Thanks. Have a great day, everyone.
Yeah, you too. Thanks.
Thank you, everybody. This was great.
Yeah.